So we're going to hear from Doug Yearwood to begin in terms of an overview of the housing crisis. Drew Garvey, the leader of the Communist Party of Ontario, is going to talk about the specific demands of our housing campaign. Sorry. We're going to look at some organizing initiatives in communities from London, Kingston, from Toronto, and then Jen Moxon is going to give us an overview of the crisis happening in the shelters. We'll open it up then for questions and answers, and of course comments, because we know people like to comment even if they don't have a question, and then we'll do a wrap up. We expect to be 90 minutes, just so that you can judge the timing accordingly. So why don't we start then with, and also if you have questions for the presenters while they're presenting, just put them in the chat and we will try, just put question first so that we can easily check those out, and we'll save them for the end of the session with the Q&A session. So Doug Yearwood is going to give us an overview of the housing crisis. Doug is working on his doctorate at Queen's University in Kingston, does his activism in Kingston, but is very, very welcome to us as a member of the Public Sector Workers Club in Toronto, and a member of the provincial committee. So Doug.
Hello, hi. Can everyone hear me and can everyone see the presentation in front of them? Just a few thumbs up if I can. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, like Helen said, I'm Doug Yearwood. It's great to be here tonight. I'm really excited about the launch of this particular campaign. You're going to hear from Drew in just a few minutes, who's going to lay out exactly how these policies meet and mesh with the crisis moment that we find ourselves in right now. And my job is to basically explain in a roundabout way, but also trying to be specific enough, what exactly is this housing crisis that we're dealing with? Because for different people, it means different things. And I recognize that, not everyone here, they might be familiar with the fact that a housing crisis exists. They might be living through one themselves, but it could mean different things to different people. So I sort of want to try and introduce the housing crisis in a number of ways. But primarily, I think what I'm going to go over is that we're feeling a crisis in affordability, in habitability, and in security. So, and I think, pretty much everyone here knows that, right? I mean, whether we're talking about homeowners or who are taking on too much debt, the collapse of the shelter and social housing systems that we know are in danger right now, or problems in our private rental units if we're living in the private market, everyone's either impacted or knows someone who's being impacted by inadequate and unaffordable housing across the province. So as a prelude to our discussion panel a little bit later on, I'm going to talk to you tonight about some of the different aspects of this crisis. But before I get to that, as you can see in front of you, I really want to establish that housing is a human right. And I want to do this for two basic reasons, right? First, I think it's important that, I hope that everyone here genuinely believes in housing as a human right and is willing to organize and struggle for housing to be recognized as a human right. But secondly, some of the work here is already done for us. And I think it's important that we're able to hold the state into account for decisions and actions that it's taken that affirm housing as a human right. It gives us a little bit more leverage when we talk about how we want to organize politically. So, the Canadian state, as you can see in front of you, has at various times in various places over the past 70 years, first in 1948 as a signatory to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and as recently as 2019, with the passing of the National Housing Act, has reaffirmed that housing is, of course, a human right. And when we say housing is a human right, we don't just mean that, it's this loose, ambiguous concept. It's actually pretty clear when you read through some of the conventions that Canada is a signatory to, that this includes affordable, habitable, accessible, and secure housing. So if any of those conditions aren't being met, we can say that the Canadian state isn't upholding its right or upholding the rights of housing, and that people's housing rights are being violated. And while housing is recognized as a human right by the Canadian government and bodies like the Ontario Human Rights Commission, I think we all also know that it's not treated as one in reality. It's more treated as a commodity or something that's bought and sold, right? So with the state having already affirmed positively the right to housing, I think it's important for us, struggling for this right to housing, to remind the state that they have signed on to these conventions, that they have stated at different points that they believe housing is a human right. And it gives us some real leverage to organize around politically.
Shouldn't people work for the human rights?
I'll get to questions in a little bit if that's cool, but I still have a little bit of this presentation to go. So I'm happy to address that in a little bit, but just hang tight. So, I basically established that the Canadian state at various points has affirmed housing as a human right and what that consists of. And now that we've done that, we can talk about the housing crisis with a little bit more clarity. So basically, I boil things down into three key dimensions. When we talk about the housing crisis, we mean a crisis in affordability. We're talking about a crisis in habitability and a crisis in security. So when we talk about affordability, we know that there's an incredible lack of affordable housing in the province. Home ownership is quite frankly out of range for probably most of us here. And although 68% of people in Canada own their home, we know that this is sort of an outdated system. Only 12% of millennials currently own a home in Ontario. And that number is far fewer than what it was just a generation ago. This has a spillover impact on the private market, and I'm sure that everyone knows that rent prices are growing and are out of control. Recent reports, just as recent as last week, suggest that we're going to see rent increases of around 10 to 15% over the next year. And we know that the average rent price for an apartment in Toronto has doubled since the great financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. So we know that, homelessness, precarious housing conditions are on the rise. There's been a lot of news over the last year and a lot of great work by comrades here in getting involved in encampments. I think Ivan will touch on that a little bit in his speech, but others have been involved as well. And we know that encampments are growing across the province and have been for the last few years. The rise in unaffordable housing has basically happened for a couple of reasons. First, I think it's worth pointing out that there's been a huge decline in the number of rent geared to income housing over the last 30 years or so. It's been almost completely decimated. Social housing that's built for people at a price that is geared to their income basically doesn't get produced anymore. Second, there's solutions that have been proposed, but as we've seen, as so often is the case, the solutions that are preferred by the government actually end up reinforcing property rights, the right to profit, and these sorts of things that are put ahead of people's human right to affordable, accessible, habitable housing. We see all the time, whether it's in Kingston or Toronto, people talk that there's a housing shortage, there's a huge shortage in housing. But we also know that there's hundreds of thousands of homes that sit empty across the province. There's other issues that compound the housing crisis, of course. Things like vacancy decontrol, which allow landlords to increase rents to, quote, what the market can bear, have made things quite a lot worse over the last 30 years or so. As it turns out, people are willing to pay a hell of a lot of money to not be homeless. There's also another problem, and I sort of mentioned this off the hop. People can't secure mortgages because there's not enough secure work for the next 25, 30 years. Banks aren't willing to pay for it, so people are turning to sort of shady lending practices and these sorts of things. But with fewer people able to access home ownership, there's an increased pool of people that are looking to rent in the private market. And there's no social housing, there's no rent geared to income housing being built. So everyone's basically competing for a limited supply of housing, and this is causing prices to increase. We also know that there's financialization that's really making things quite a lot worse. So there's real estate investment trusts and institutional investors who've been buying a lot of the housing that does come onto the market. But there's also a decline in pensions, and landlording has become normal. And so you start to see people, what I call petty bourgeois landlords, who own a few properties coming up, and there's like this increased hoarding of housing in general. So in general, what I argue is that the rise in unaffordable housing comes from the fact that housing is treated as a commodity, something that we buy and sell on the market, rather than something that's a fundamental human right that we all recognize it as here. There's also a crisis in habitability. There's growing recognition in this province that housing is not suitable for people's needs. Every week, it seems like I hear or read about issues that tenants are having with pests and bugs. This isn't just something that's local and contained or confined rather to Kingston, where I do a lot of my organizing. And it doesn't really seem to matter if you live in social or private rental housing, or if you make $5,000 or $50,000 a year. There's bed bugs and pests that are impacting people across the province. Ivan and I, who you'll hear from in a bit, Ivan is my good friend, my comrade in Kingston. We've spoken to quite a few people. I don't have a concrete number for you, but we talk to people all the time who say, they prefer to be homeless and take their chances in the street than live in a house where their landlord terrorizes them and where there's pests at night that keep them up and bite them and all these sorts of awful things. So it's an issue that doesn't really receive as much attention as it should in Ontario, because landlords have controlled this narrative. They like to blame the poor. They like to blame people who have bed bugs and say that they're dirty. And in reality, we know that maintenance is a landlord's responsibility to ensure that places aren't infested, and that infestation happens as a result of buildings being old and landlords not maintaining things as well as they should. There's also a growing problem with landlords who don't respond to maintenance requests, and this seems to be heightened over the last 10 years or so. I was looking at a community in Ottawa that I studied for my research, for my dissertation. And once the Haringate, this community in Ottawa South, was sold to a real estate investment trust, the number of bylaw complaints rose from around 10 a year to well over 200. This is because there's an increased incentive structure for people for these financialized landlords to not actually do the maintenance requests. They want tenants to leave. And they want to cut costs as much as possible because it's good for shareholders, even though it's not good for the people living in these houses. There's also huge problems with overcrowding rather. There's a 2014 study that I looked at through the University of Toronto that was looking at the Parkdale community here in Toronto. They found that over half the people living in Parkdale are living in overcrowded and cramped living conditions. The Globe and Mail ran an article in May 2020. You can see it on the screen in front of you, talking about how overcrowded housing was linked to the spread of COVID-19 and how this was felt more disproportionately among racialized populations. And so overcrowding is another problem that we see. There's a crisis of habitability in this province, and that's just another one of the dimensions that I'm talking about. The last thing that I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to take all night, is that there's a crisis in housing insecurity. It's undoubtedly heightened over the last 2 years throughout COVID, when so many of us have been confined to our homes. But the crisis of security at its core is driven by increased powers that landlords now have to evict, loopholes that already existed in the Residential Tenancies Act, and the lack of decent paying jobs and adequate social supports. So the Ford government introduced Bill 184 in the midst of the pandemic. This bill was dubbed the eviction bill by tenants because it fast-tracked eviction through pretty coercive repayment plans. So if a tenant was behind on rent, new amendments in the Residential Tenancies Act allowed landlords to bypass the landlord and tenant board and get tenants to promise to repay. If a tenant fails to repay for any reason, including a loss of work or illness, the landlord has the right to evict the tenant without needing to go through the LTB. The bill also made illegal rent hikes legal after 12 months and allows landlords to bring former tenants to the LTB. So we're seeing conditions are quickly shifting and are actually, a rising insecurity in the province as a result of Bill 184. But this is just one aspect of how housing insecurity is on the rise. Even prior to the pandemic, there were enough loopholes in tenant law that allowed landlords to evict tenants to increase the rent price, typically through what the media refers to as demoviction, so units that are going to be demolished, or renoviction, units that are going to be renovated where the landlord kicks the tenant out. There's also loopholes that we're pretty familiar with in Kingston, where there's family use or owner-occupied use, where they say, I need to move into this unit for whatever reason, you need to get out. Most of the time, it seems like no one actually moves in. except for a new tenant who's paying, a few $100s more a month in rent. And so we're seeing, I call this a rise in insecurity, or the insecurity tenure. And, I think like some of this would be fine in theory if there's lots of housing available and if people had lots of money and there's lots of options to choose where to live. But we know that's not the case. There's low vacancy rates around the province. There's been, a 30 or 40 year, it seems like, cut to the types of social supports that are offered to people that they're able to receive through OW and ODSP. And it basically makes it impossible for people who are making, minimum wage or less than that, or even more than that, to afford and find adequate, secure, and habitable housing. So, we'll get to what I can do in a little bit, I suppose, but I sort of want to conclude my remarks right now by saying that, the housing crisis, as I've explained, can be seen over a number of dimensions. If you want to talk about how unaffordable things are, if you want to talk about how there's rampant bed bugs and pests across the province, or if you want to talk about, the way that the state, through its legal apparatus and whatever, has made things less secure for tenants in general over the last number of years. I haven't had time in this presentation to get into the ins and outs. I'm happy to have this all come up in discussion. But I think it's important to point out that we're launching this housing campaign because we believe that the positions supported here go a long way in addressing people's material insecurity along some of the things that I've mentioned. As Drew is going to explain, the demands of this campaign are what we need if we hope to move in directions that actually institutionalize housing as a human right. The government of Ontario absolutely needs to be pressured to reverse course from the way things are going right now. And I believe, and I think everyone is here because they know that mass mobilization is the key thing that we need to do if we want to see this change come to fruition. So we want to connect with tenant unions. We want to connect with the labor movement. We want to hear from what's going on in parts of your community and figure out how we can connect with them to get this message out there. We'll talk about different things that we can do in a bit, but I think it's great that everyone is here. There's 74 people, and I think that's an excellent start. And I hope that that something here resonates with you. I'll pass things off to Drew right away, or Helen will. This campaign's set to run through the election. And I really do think that, there's no other party or no other movement that's actually putting forward a vision of how things could be different, with analysis sort of talking about why things are the way they are, that doesn't ultimately succumb to sort of supply and demand, boring, right-wing economics. And we're here today to sort of push back against that, hopefully get people excited about ending this horrible crisis and get to work on that. So thank you very much. I hope that you learned a thing or two, or it looks like, there's some comments in the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at them, but hopefully this has been thought-provoking and we can have a great discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was really, really great. A great introduction to why we need a housing campaign right now. We're going to move it over then to Drew Garvey, who, as I mentioned earlier, still is the provincial secretary, which means he's the leader of our party in Ontario. And Drew will give us an overview of the housing campaign that we're launching tonight.
Muted, off to a great start here.
Okay.
Thanks, comrades, and thanks, comrades and friends, for attending tonight. It's my pleasure to report to you some of the thinking of the provincial committee as to the goals, strategies, and tactics of the housing campaign, or what we're calling the Housing for People Not Profit campaign. Thank you, Doug, for your presentation. I'm sure many of us have been involved in discussions about skyrocketing costs of rent and housing with neighbors, friends, and family. Although clear class analysis of the problem, as Doug has provided, may be more rare, it is clear that working people across the province and country have already been forced to pay attention to the housing crisis. So the objective base of this campaign, to get an audience and active participation, is already there. That's what we think. Millions of people are in core housing need in this province. 700,000 something households, so that's millions of people. Many more are having their standard of living substantially reduced by increasing housing costs. The struggle for decent housing is one of the sharpest struggles working people face to raise their standard of living in the province of Ontario right now and across the country. People are looking for answers that reflect their own experience. So our job is to mobilize people to win real solutions. And what are those solutions that we're putting forward, or at least the immediate demands? So we've got two immediate demands that would immediately make a real difference, and both of them are not the market-based solutions and the technocratic liberal stuff that's out there being floated. Those demands are to develop and implement an emergency plan to build 200,000 new publicly owned social housing units and upgrade and retrofit existing units to address the massive core housing need in all of Ontario, and to legislate rent rollbacks and controls for all renters in Ontario to ensure no one has to pay more than 20% of income on housing. So the 20% is important because, as we've seen, the term affordable housing is used and abused. It's important to have the benchmark of what we're talking about. Then we have a longer list of housing demands, also urgently necessary. These are what we're calling the People's Housing Policy. We're highlighting these on the campaign website, which you can check out at housingforpeople.ca. But they're not the main demands that are on the flyers, petitions, and posters. So as the website says, as the introduction to these policies, the Housing for People Not Profit campaign is demanding the immediate mass construction of social housing and rent rollbacks across the province. But this is only the beginning. We need comprehensive provincial housing policies that put people before profit. This would include recognizing housing as a human right and introducing a tenant's bill of rights and provide a provincial housing program to ensure adequate housing based on need. Build 200,000 units of affordable social housing. So we say that in the main demands, but then we add more long form here, 550,000 units of affordable housing, 15,000 units of transitional housing, and maintain levels of affordable housing based on need. So these are the numbers that we approximate, although it's difficult to get Ontario-wide statistics, because a lot of this depends on city. These are the numbers we think would cover the current need. So that would have to be adjusted in the future. These are just the current demands based on what we can understand from the current situation. Upgrade and maintain existing units so that they are safe, secure, affordable, accessible, and environmentally sound. Implement democratic and sustainable planning to tackle issues of urban sprawl and environmental degradation. Enact rent control legislation to cover all rental units, including vacant units, and legislate rent rollbacks, as we say in the original. But talking about vacancy decontrol is important. Deliver proper building inspections for rental housing and enforce penalties for landlords who do not meet standards. Make bed bugs a public health issue. Introduce maximum temperatures into the Property Standards Act. Ban evictions or utility cutoffs due to involuntary unemployment, including layoff, health issues, strike, or lockout. And finally, develop expropriation policies to ensure adequate rent geared to income housing stock. So last year, the Ontario Committee decided to update and relaunch the Housing for People nonprofit campaign. The first iteration of this campaign was in 2017, and since then, the situation has only gotten worse. Fortunately, our party size and influence has grown a little bit since then. The other development since 2017 has been the election of the Ford government, which represents the most aggressive sections of capital in the province. The Ontario PCs remain the preferred big business party of developers and landlords and some of the chief creators and profiteers of the housing crisis. It's from this political situation and the short-term and long-term goals that the short-term and long-term goals can take shape. So I'd like to name a few of those. The long-term goal is clear, and that's to win the right to housing in Ontario. How do we do this? There would need to be a fundamental shift in government policies away from facilitating the commodification of housing towards the public provision of housing according to need. So the long-term goal, that's clear. And we include that one with the two other demands of rent rollbacks and social housing on the flyers and petitions. In the language of the flyer, that's to introduce a comprehensive provincial social housing program that treats housing as a public utility and delivers it according to need. So now let's look at the shorter term goals of the campaign. First of which is to inject class analysis into the public debate on the housing crisis. So the problem is not red tape, as Ford says these days. If we let developers gut all zoning laws, for example, we will not be closer to realizing the right to housing. The problem is not immigration causing a shortage of housing. Xenophobic and racist immigration policies will not lower rents. The problem is not caused by foreign speculators. Yes, they exist, but there's many more Canadian speculators out there. As we highlight on our flyer, which is being distributed across the province, the causes of the crisis are government austerity and deregulation, which has opened the door to corporate financialization and speculation. This is the kind of class analysis which can inoculate working people from neoliberal schemes and reformist tinkering, such as inclusionary zoning, as well as from right-wing populism and fascism. So this is the battle of ideas, and we know that we are a relatively small party, but we need to be as loud as possible to be heard on these important issues. Another goal of the campaign is to strengthen the fight back against Ford, and more broadly, to strengthen the fight back against austerity. The provincial election is 4 months away. This is not a narrow electoralist housing campaign, but the timing of it is important, and it situates the campaign. The Ontario PCs are still the party to beat, and both the Liberals and the NDP have failed time and time again to articulate a fundamentally different way forward for Ontario. Defeating Ford isn't everything, but he must be defeated on the way to winning meaningful change. That will only come through mass action and demands that resonate with working people. The milquetoast reforms of the opposition parties at Queen's Park have so far failed to mobilize people. If we can bring together tenant organizations with labor, Indigenous resistance, anti-racist movements, the women's and student movement, and other people's movements, even in a small way, we will have built new alliances. Our party puts forward the idea of a people's coalition that would fight for a program of far-reaching reforms to curb corporate power, which would build workers' power and open the door to socialism. That's our basic program. This campaign is one vehicle to help build some of the alliances necessary for a people's coalition. At this stage, most of this would be done at the local level, and the organizations and forces will differ from community to community and the potential allies. Through escalating united action, stronger unity and militancy can be built. But what does that really look like? One of the key strategies is to link up the tenants movement with the labor movement. So why is this important? Both movements are organized components of the working class. However, the labor movement is organized at the point of production rather than consumption, and is more organized these days with more resources. Perhaps more importantly than the actual state of the labor movement is the potential power of the labor movement, because it has the ability to withhold labor power or to strike. The tenants movement is, of course, very important to housing struggles because that's its focus. More obvious. Building unity and action between the labor movement and the tenants movement can help overcome subjective ideological and leadership problems in both movements. We know that the labor movement leadership is dominated by social democracy at the moment, including many leaders that want to outsource all political action to the NDP or worse still, the Liberal Party. There's certainly a strong tide in the labor movement right now that wants to exclusively focus on getting the NDP elected in swing ridings to defeat Ford. This is to the detriment of building a movement for fundamental change, and we believe this narrow strategy may help Ford to win in June, and we can't let this happen. The tenants movement, which has seen an upswing in activity just before and especially during the pandemic, has different sections, some of which are led by social democratic forces and some which have more anarchist leanings. In both cases, there is often a reluctance to fight for far-reaching political demands on the provincial government that can mobilize working people. Tenants unions that lean to the right often focus on the most realistic, quote unquote, realistic reforms, meaning those that can be won through lobbying liberal politicians. Tenants unions that lean to the left sometimes ignore government policy altogether, instead narrowly focusing on pitched battles with landlords, cops enforcing evictions, or mutual aid. Sadly, ignoring government policy doesn't make its effects go away. So I'm not trying to be sectarian here. On the contrary, I think we absolutely need to work with everybody possible on this campaign and in general in the fight back. But I'm trying to show that this campaign and these demands can play a role in bringing together the labor movement and the tenants movement, where various ideologies coexist, in order to fight for the demands on the provincial government. So this isn't happening in a big way right now, but it can, and it would strengthen both the labor movement and the tenants movement and help build the broader fight back at a crucial time before an important provincial election. And we know this is possible because we've done it, some of it at least before. Most recently, the 2017 Housing for People campaign was successful in getting 6 unions to submit resolutions to the OFL that called for labor to support the demands of the campaign. The OFL that year passed the resolution, which called for the OFL to launch a campaign with labor councils and affiliates to mobilize workers to demand a provincial social housing program. Unfortunately, not much action ever materialized. The next year, Doug Ford was elected, creating more confusion. In 2020, comrades active in the labor movement passed several resolutions at labor councils in Southern Ontario to get labor councils to work with tenants unions to defeat Bill 184, which is still on the books, unfortunately, and to fight for social housing construction. These were steps forward, but we now need to work harder at getting labor, or at least the local and labor councils that are most militant, to pass resolutions and then join actions and mobilize their people. That's a key tactic for this spring. Before we move on to other tactics, I want to mention that there are other movements that we should consider approaching at a local level to see if they can support these demands. Some more obvious ones, but not an exhaustive list, would include the women's movement, since demands for more women's shelters and social housing would have a positive effect in fighting violence against women. Anti-racist and immigrants' rights organization may also be good allies. We've seen, well, as Doug said in his presentation, we've seen most recently with the racialized impact of the pandemic that access to decent housing was a key factor in racist health outcomes. Inequality in housing in general is a key factor in deepening systemic racism. So the class orientation and leadership of these kinds of organizations varies widely from place to place. So these possibilities should probably be discussed locally in terms of who's out there to work with. The point is that we should try and make this campaign as broad as possible. On the website and the materials, it says Communist Party of Canada, Ontario. We did that because we initiated the campaign and didn't want to erase ourselves. But if a local coalition forms behind these demands, we would be more than happy to help facilitate printing more materials with a coalition's name on them. We do not want to be the sole owners of these demands, for sure. The provincial executive and the Housing Commission is in the process of finalizing draft motions in a joint open letter for sign-on for labor and community organizations. This will hopefully help you outreach to allies. We would also be happy to find comrades that can speak to any meetings on these issues and the campaign should you need that kind of support. So I just want to share quickly my screen here. I'm wrapping up, don't worry. Okay, can somebody, yeah, that looks like it's working here. So let me, okay, I can still read my writing here. Okay, so in addition to this, to the open letter and the resolutions we're working on, we still have around 3,000 flyers that haven't gone out for distribution yet, and we can always print more. So we've shipped out over 1,000 posters, but we still have a couple hundred left in the office and can print more of these too. We're just printing Spanish, Russian, and Chinese translations of the posters for particular neighborhoods. And we obviously need to do French and possibly other languages if you've got a neighborhood in mind. There are already petitions on the website. The online petition has almost 300 signatures. There's a print petition available for download that can be circulated. We're asking all clubs to start collecting signatures on this and return it to the office. It's in the correct format that it can be presented at Queen's Park, if we can get it tabled. But perhaps more importantly, it's a tool to talk to people, give them a flyer, and collect interested people's contact info for further mobilization. If you would like to, if you'd like any print materials, please email me go to the website, the email for the parties on the website, Housing for People, and they can and will be mailed out to you. As the health situation gets better and we emerge from our caves, those of us that are fortunate enough to be able to isolate, we will need to move the campaign from an agitational one of postering and flyering into more actions. Here we need to be creative and have a plan that escalates. Banner drops and car convoys can be done now under the current health restrictions. Pickets and demos outside Tory MPPs' offices would likely be supported by Labour councils in the near future. We can provide local speakers for any public meetings. And one thing to consider is the Tory photo ops will start coming fast and furiously in the lead up to election season. We'll have to react quickly and watch the news carefully and media advisories, but we should try and crash those announcements and press conferences and make sure the demands of the campaign are heard there. They've already got the cameras pointed at them and they're spewing garbage, so the cameras might as well hear some good message. Street theater and street art are other possibilities, going door to door in neighborhoods involved in struggles against landlords. All these things and more we should talk about. Communist Party clubs or any broader campaign committees should discuss a local strategy that fits with capacity and potential local allies. So this campaign is already being well received with the limited work that has been done so far. The online petition has not really been pushed that hard, and it has been signed by hundreds of people, most of whom are not communists. I've had one non-party member walk into the office and ask for flyers to distribute at his co-op after he's seen posters on the street. People are looking for something that cuts through much of the bullshit that accompanies the public debate about the housing crisis. And people are looking for a campaign that highlights the goal of a fundamental shift towards finally realizing housing as a human right. It's long overdue. Real action to fight the housing crisis is long overdue. So let's get out there and get our message heard. Thank you, Comrade Chair.